Sam Barkley had always preferred working with his hands rather than sitting behind a desk. After decades of fixing boats, restoring motors, and teaching younger guys how to rebuild a carburetor without wrecking the seal, he had finally decided to take a break from the noise of the city and the constant hum of obligation. That's how he ended up at Lakeside Hollow, a small, unremarkable community built around an aging lake where half the docks leaned slightly to the left and everyone's idea of privacy depended on how loud their dogs barked. He wasn't here to make friends or be anyone's project. He was here for the contract. 6 weeks to rebuild a vintage outboard engine for a collector up north. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was clean, honest, and it paid well. The cabin he rented sat on a gently sloping patch of land at the southern tip of the lake. It wasn't much: a tired wooden deck, chipped blue paint, and a screen door that whined like a child every time it opened. But it came with its own dock, private, clearly outlined in the lease with fresh survey documents and detailed boundary lines. The dock needed work, sure. Its planks were warped, nails rusted through, and the supports swayed more than they should in a light wind. But to Sam, it was a functional workspace, an extension of his bench, a place to haul out the engine for testing once it was reassembled. It wasn't a sunbathing pad or a fishing platform or a playground. It was his, temporarily, and he was going to treat it that way. From the first morning, he noticed her. Karen Rhodes, the neighbor 2 lots over. A woman in her late 60s. She had the kind of presence that didn't so much introduce itself as impose. Her house stood like a prize on the edge of a well-manicured lawn, surrounded by hydrangeas and wind chimes, with patio furniture arranged just so. The first time she spoke to him, Sam was hauling a toolbox down to the dock. She stood on the path, arms folded, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That dock's always been for everyone," she said, as if it were a matter of local tradition, not private property. "Oh..." Sam had turned slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, unsure if she was joking. "It's in my lease," he replied calmly. "Private use. Lot 48. Karen didn't blink. That's what the last renter said, and the one before that. Didn't stop them from sharing it once they settled in. He didn't answer, just looked at her, long enough to remind her that he wasn't here to accommodate neighborhood customs. Over the next few days, it became clear that Karen was not used to resistance. She began lingering near the path more often, especially in the early mornings when Sam would carry coffee and his parts bin to the dock. Once, she brought a folding chair and sat just inside her property line, reading a magazine and glancing over at him every few minutes. Another time, she called out across the yards while watering her garden. "Beautiful weather for a swim. Shame not to share that dock, don't you think?" Sam didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had already placed a small, professionally made sign at the top of the dock steps. Private property, no trespassing, not for community use. It wasn't confrontational, just factual. Still, it was ignored. 2 mornings later, Sam found a pair of flip-flops and a towel laid out at the end of the dock. No one was in sight, but the message was clear. He gathered the items, folded the towel, and left them neatly at the edge of Karen's lawn. That afternoon, he heard her speaking loudly to another neighbor, just close enough for the words to carry. "Some people think a lease gives them the right to act like kings. That dock's been open to this community for over 30 years. Suddenly, we're supposed to get permission." The neighbor muttered something Sam couldn't hear, and Karen huffed. "We'll see how long he lasts." Sam wasn't someone who sought out fights. He was methodical, quiet, and deliberate. But he understood property, responsibility, and boundaries, both physical and personal. He had seen enough over the years, greedy clients, pushy inspectors, arrogant foremen, to know when someone was testing him. Karen didn't want access. She wanted control. The dock wasn't just wood and nails to her. It was a symbol. And symbols, when they're suddenly withheld, create outrage in people who've grown too used to entitlement. Still, he tried to stay professional. He didn't confront her, didn't escalate. He kept his documentation in order, took date-stamped photographs of the dock, and reviewed his lease terms with the owner over the phone. "You've got full use," the landlord confirmed. "She's always a problem this time of year. Just ignore her. She goes away eventually." But Karen didn't go away. The next week, Sam caught a glimpse of her guiding a small group of women down toward the dock while he was inside. By the time he stepped out, they were gone. But wet footprints dotted the boards, and someone had moved his toolbox 3 feet to the left. He didn't say a word. He just installed a simple chain at the top of the steps and locked it. The next day, he came back to find the chain cut. Not broken. Cut. Cleanly, like someone had used bolt cutters. The lock was gone, too. In its place, a polite note in loopy cursive taped to the dock post. "You can't block community access. We have a right. Karen." Sam read it twice, then folded it into a Ziploc bag and added it to a growing folder inside the cabin labeled simply, "Incidents." That evening, he sat on the dock with a beer, watching the sun scatter itself across the surface of the lake. He wasn't angry, yet. He was calculating. People like Karen operated under the illusion that they were owed something just because they'd been around long enough to forget what wasn't theirs. She didn't understand where she stood, but she would, because Sam wasn't a man who needed to shout to make a point. He just made damn sure that, when the point came, it landed hard and without warning. And Karen, well, she hadn't gotten wet yet. But her time was coming. It started with the garbage. Small, careless things at first. A crumpled soda can nestled between the dock planks. A torn snack wrapper pressed into the corner of the steps where Sam never left his tools. At first, he thought it might have blown in from somewhere, maybe caught on a gust from the opposite shore. But then came the half-eaten sandwich tucked under a dock cleat like someone had stashed it there mid-bite, and the unmistakable scent of sunscreen lingering near the rail where he normally leaned to test outboard engines. Sam didn't say anything. He just picked it all up, bagged it, and logged the date. The next morning, footprints appeared again, barefoot, smeared with lake mud. A single pair headed out and back. It wasn't hard to guess who they belonged to. Sam installed a motion-activated spotlight on the boathouse wall, angled just enough to wash across the dock after dusk. It wasn't a trap, and it wasn't hidden. Just illumination. That same evening, around 9:40, the light clicked on while Sam was finishing paperwork inside. When he stepped out, there was no one in sight, only a ripple across the lake's glassy surface. He waited, hands in his pockets, jaw set. The light eventually timed out and clicked off, leaving the night to reclaim its shadows. But it happened again 2 nights later, and again no one visible, only the unmistakable splash of something, or someone, slipping away into the dark. Ew. Sam didn't bother chasing phantoms. He called the property owner the next morning, calmly explained the situation, and got approval to upgrade the boundary marker. A second sign went up, larger than the first, this one bolted into a cedar post and set into concrete at the top of the dock's stairs. "Private access only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." That sign lasted 3 days before it was found in the water, floating belly up like a dead fish. Sam retrieved it, dried it, and placed it inside the cabin as further documentation. He didn't confront Karen. He didn't need to. The tension had already begun to thicken into something almost visible, like fog curling just above the grass. Neighbors who once waved began nodding with uncertainty, some choosing instead to glance away entirely. Karen, meanwhile, became louder. She started talking about him to anyone within earshot, at the mailbox, by the community board, on walks where she intentionally slowed to pass his property. She used words like aggressive, territorial, and uncooperative. Sam heard the stories come back in pieces, distorted by the inevitable gossip cycle until he was no longer a tenant fixing a boat. He was the angry outsider trying to privatize the lake. Things escalated the following weekend when Sam came down early to start working on a lower frame assembly and found a towel draped neatly over the dock rail, along with a water bottle, a pair of sunglasses, and a beach chair. Karen's voice followed moments later, light and falsely surprised. "Oh, you're using it already. I figured you'd be sleeping in on a Sunday." Sam didn't answer. He picked up the towel and the chair, carried them back up the path, and set them gently just beyond her property line. No words, just return and retreat. Karen responded by filing a complaint, not to the police, not to the landlord, but to the local maintenance board, claiming a public hazard had been created by Sam's construction work on the dock. The board issued a courtesy visit, not a violation, just a neighborly check-in. The rep was a young guy, polite but visibly uncomfortable, holding a clipboard he didn't want to use. "I'm sure it's nothing," he muttered, "but she's persistent. Says there are exposed nails and unstable footing. Said someone could slip, fall, sue." Sam walked the rep out to the dock, pointed at each finished segment, listed materials, quoted inspection clearances. "It's safer than half the docks on this lake," he said evenly. The rep nodded, satisfied, and apologized before leaving. "Just doing my job." That night, Sam sat longer than usual by the lake. He didn't drink, he didn't make calls, he simply watched. At some point past midnight he spotted her shadow again, Karen, crouched low near the hedges at the edge of his property line, watching. Not trespassing, not speaking, just watching. And that was worse, because it wasn't about swimming anymore. It wasn't about access, it was about making a point. The final line came the following Thursday when Sam returned from town with parts and groceries, only to find two teenagers lounging on the dock. They were soaking their legs, blasting music from a phone speaker and tossing bottle caps into the lake. When he asked where they were from, one of them shrugged and said, "Karen said it's fine. Said you're just renting." Sam nodded once, didn't raise his voice, didn't scold. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." The kids complied, muttering something about, "Chill out, old man," as they climbed the path. Sam didn't stop them. He didn't need to. He called the police. The report was simple. Documented trespass. No charges filed, just logged. The responding officer, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, stood by the dock rail with Sam as he took down notes. "We've had noise complaints before," he admitted, "but it's rare anyone actually files a report. Most people just let her wear herself out." Sam looked at him and said plainly, "I don't believe in hoping people change when you can show them the law." The officer nodded slowly. "Well, you just did." The next morning, Karen was waiting near the mailbox when Sam stepped outside. Her smile was gone. Her tone was cool and clipped. "You called the cops over a couple of kids? You really going to turn this into something ugly?" Sam looked at her. Not through her. Not around her. At her. "It already is," he said. "You made it that way. And it's going to stop now." Karen didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away. But Sam could tell, by the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she clenched her hands just behind her back, that she was furious. Not because she lost, but because someone had finally stood up to her and done it in a way she couldn't twist. And that was when Sam knew things were about to change. Not because she'd give up, but because she wouldn't. Not until the lake itself reminded her that the water didn't care who thought they owned it. And it always got the last word. The weather shifted with a suddenness that seemed almost theatrical. Thunderheads rolled in from the north and squatted low over the lake for nearly 4 days, smothering the shoreline in a misty haze that blurred everything past 100 feet. Rain pattered steadily against the windows of Sam's cabin, and each morning brought a deeper, quieter atmosphere, as if the lake itself had decided to hold its breath. Sam used the time to work indoors, adjusting components, reviewing diagrams, double-checking ignition patterns. He didn't touch the dock, not because he feared Karen's retaliation or the now undeniable hostility she radiated with every glance, but because, after filing the police report and securing written confirmation from the landlord regarding the boundaries and his rights, he had nothing left to prove. It wasn't until the rain stopped that he saw what had changed. The dock, once straight and weathered but reliable, now bore clear signs of tampering. Not sabotage, nothing violent or obviously destructive, but something more insidious. The railings had been subtly loosened. One of the support posts near the waterline was now wedged at a strange angle, as if someone had pried at it with a crowbar and then repositioned it just enough to create the illusion of structural integrity. The screws on the lower steps had been partially unscrewed, then forced back into place, stripping the threading. It was the kind of damage meant to fail slowly, a hidden fault that would give way under stress, ideally while someone was using it. Sam knelt down, inspected the bolts, the joins, the spacing of the slats. Every detail betrayed careful intention, not random wear or nature's hand. Someone had come down there during the storm, under cover of darkness and weather, and tried to set a trap. He didn't panic. He didn't rush to accuse. He simply documented. Close-up photos, notes on condition, measurements taken and logged against prior maintenance records. He forwarded everything to the property owner with a brief summary and requested permission to install 2 discrete security cameras, one facing the dock, the other angled toward the path leading down from the woods. Permission was granted within the hour. The cameras arrived the next day and were installed that evening, silently clicking into place beneath the eaves and along the trunk of a tree that offered the perfect vantage point. Sam didn't hide them, but he didn't announce them either. He just wanted to be ready for what everyone already knew was coming. 2 nights later, just past 11 p.m., the camera caught its first footage. A lone figure, wrapped in a long raincoat, crept down the slope and paused at the edge of the dock, flashlight cupped in one hand, a small bag slung over the opposite shoulder. The face was obscured by the hood and low lighting, but the gait was unmistakable. Short, impatient steps, a forward lean of the torso, the way the left hand twitched before reaching for anything. Karen. She moved slowly, scanning the boards, as if looking for something she could disturb without leaving a trace. She knelt briefly near the rail Sam had already repaired, then stood again and began rearranging objects near the edge, shifting the bait bucket he'd stored under a cover, fiddling with the mooring cleats, finally removing the solar dock light and placing it face down to obscure visibility. The next morning, Sam downloaded the footage and watched it twice. Not for satisfaction, he felt none, but to prepare. He saved the video to 2 separate drives, backed it up to cloud storage, and then added it to his incident folder with a timestamp and summary. Then, without hesitation, he filed a second report, this time naming her directly. No threats, no speculation, just the facts. Trespassing, tampering with private property, visual confirmation. The response from the police was swift and formal. A warning was issued, delivered in person, and Sam watched from the driveway as the same officer from the first call walked up to Karen's door. The exchange was brief. Karen stood tall, arms crossed, her voice rising once in indignation before quieting into a terse, unwilling nod. The officer left without incident. That evening, her curtains remained closed. Her garden, normally tended every morning at sunrise, went untouched. But the silence didn't mean surrender. It meant regrouping. 3 days passed. Sam kept to his routine. Early mornings, steady progress on the engine. An occasional walk to the village store for supplies. He avoided confrontation, kept conversation brief, stayed alert. Then, on the 4th day, something new arrived. An envelope taped to the cabin's door in clear plastic, addressed by hand in stiff, slanted writing. It was a formal letter, not from Karen, but from her attorney. A cease and desist, accusing Sam of harassment, unauthorized surveillance, and intimidation. It alleged that his security cameras infringed on her reasonable expectation of privacy, that his repeated complaints constituted a pattern of targeted aggression, and that she would pursue legal action if his campaign of hostility continued. The wording was careful, legalistic, emotionally charged. It was also entirely empty. Sam handed the letter to a paralegal friend from his old neighborhood, who reviewed it with a single glance. "It's bluff and bluster," he said. "No teeth, but it shows you're getting under her skin. Keep your records clean. Keep your posture neutral. You've already done the right thing." Sam nodded, but he knew better than to take that as comfort. People like Karen didn't back down when they were wrong. They escalated. Sure enough, the next violation wasn't at the dock. It was inside the workshop. Late one afternoon, while finishing a reassembly, Sam discovered that several tools had been rearranged. At first, he thought he'd misplaced them, working too fast, getting distracted. But then he noticed something worse. The engine cradle had been shifted 2 inches to the left, its base now sitting crooked on its supports. Someone had entered his workspace. Not stolen, not destroyed, just disrupted. It was a message. One meant to unnerve, not expose. Sam checked the locks. All intact. Windows sealed. There were no signs of forced entry. Then he realized the rear service door, which he rarely used and had assumed was permanently sealed, had been opened, carefully, and then latched again. The lock, older and rusted, had likely given way with the right pressure. It was a gap in his line, and she had found it. He changed the locks that night, reinforced the hinges, added motion sensors and deadbolts. No drama, no declarations, just an answer. Karen, of course, responded not with confrontation, but with subtle aggression. Lawn work at dawn, her mower idling within feet of his boundary. Loud, passive-aggressive conversations on speakerphone just outside his fence line. And once, a loud accusation that drifted through the trees, tossed casually at no one and everyone. Some people think a camera makes them God, but all it does is show you're scared. Sam didn't flinch. He just finished his work, filed another quiet report, and kept moving forward. Because the first escalation wasn't about proving dominance, it was about teaching someone where the limits really were. And Karen? She was about to learn the hard way, wet, cold, and in front of exactly the right people. But she didn't know that yet. The day of the inspection began like any other. Quiet, slightly overcast, the kind of weather that settled over the lake like a second skin. Sam was already outside by sunrise, wiping condensation from the bench and checking the latest epoxy set on the support brackets. The air was cool and calm, broken only by the distant sound of geese moving across the sky. There was no ceremony in the moment, no sense of impending confrontation, but Sam had a sharpness to his movements that morning, the quiet preparation of someone who knew that small moments often marked large shifts. He had received a notice from the board's Property Oversight Committee, a formality they claimed just a standard assessment after a neighbor expressed concern about structural safety and community standards. Sam had smiled at the wording. Community standards, he thought, were what people invoked when they had nothing else to stand on. And structural safety? He had dated inspections, signed permits, and photographic logs to silence that line before it left anyone's lips. At precisely 10 a.m., a dark sedan pulled up near the gravel edge of his driveway, and a man in a navy windbreaker stepped out, clipboard in hand, followed by a young woman carrying a tablet. They introduced themselves as David and Colleen, contracted assessors from the county, not affiliated with any neighborhood organization, there to perform an independent evaluation of the dock and the adjacent shoreline. Sam nodded, extended a hand, and led them down the path toward the lake. He didn't try to explain anything in advance. He didn't present a defense. He simply let them see what was already there. The dock, now fully repaired, stood firm and level, with new cross-bracing and properly treated timber. The stairs were even, the bolts flush, the angles true. It wasn't beautiful, but it was efficient, and built to last. They spent nearly an hour taking notes, measurements, photos. Sam answered their questions directly, showed them receipts, and opened the storage unit to display sealed materials and tools. No hesitation, no gaps. He could see the subtle shift in their posture as the visit progressed, initial professional skepticism giving way to calm confidence. They weren't being deceived, and they knew it. Halfway through the inspection, Sam noticed a figure standing at the edge of the Karen's yard. She wasn't hiding. She was openly watching, arms crossed, a thin cardigan draped over her shoulders like armor. Her face was unreadable from that distance, but her presence was unmistakable. At the end of the visit, David turned to Sam and offered a rare, dry smile. "Honestly," he said, "I've seen worse at brand-new construction sites. You're well within spec. No red flags." Colleen nodded and added, "We'll file the report officially, but I don't see any grounds for complaint." Sam thanked them, shook hands again, and walked them back to the car. As they drove away, he didn't look toward Karen. He didn't need to. He had already won that round. But the real shift came the next morning, not with a knock, but with a conversation. Sam was at the local supply store, picking up sanding discs and a new coil for the ignition rig, when an older man he vaguely recognized from the neighborhood approached him near the back aisle. His name was Vince, retired, kept mostly to himself, owned the house 2 doors down from Karen's. He didn't waste time. "You know," he said, voice low, eyes scanning the shelves as if reading labels. "She's done this before. Last guy left after 3 months. Took him weeks to get out of the hole she dug." Sam raised an eyebrow but said nothing, so Vince continued. "She files complaints like they're lottery tickets. Pushes people until they push back, then cries foul. The trick is, you're the first one that didn't blink, and now she doesn't know what to do." There was no malice in Vince's tone, just quiet observation. "She's losing control. That's when people like her start to unravel." Sam nodded once. He wasn't flattered by the comment, nor particularly relieved. But it confirmed something he'd suspected all along. Karen wasn't acting out of principle or even spite. She was driven by the terror of irrelevance, of losing the small territory she had carved out for herself over decades. When someone refused to recognize that territory, her whole sense of power began to fracture. And fractures, once exposed, tend to spread fast. That fracture became visible 2 days later. It was early evening. The lake unusually still, and Sam was finishing a final pass over the engine's calibration when he heard shouting, not distant, but close, loud enough to echo across the surface and back. He turned toward the noise and saw Karen on her dock, arguing with a younger woman. Her daughter, he guessed, or perhaps a niece. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Karen was angry, the other woman trying to calm her down. At one point, Karen gestured broadly in Sam's direction, though she wasn't looking at him. He stood still, wrench in hand, listening not to the content but to the emotion. Sharp, defensive, cornered. The next morning, another letter arrived. Not legal this time. Just a note, handwritten in block letters and slid under his door. It read, "You've made your point. I hope you're proud. This won't end the way you think." Sam read it once, then folded it and placed it in the folder with the rest. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because the escalation wasn't coming from him. He had laid his foundation, documented everything, and remained measured throughout. It was Karen who was unraveling, and the lake had begun to reflect it. That night, something shifted. Sam went down to the dock for one last check before bed, and when he turned on the floodlight, he saw it. A garden gnome, small, ceramic, red hat and all, sitting in the middle of the dock. Not threatening, not dangerous, just absurd. A statement not of resistance, but of mockery. And Sam laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a quiet, exhausted exhale that said more than 1,000 arguments ever could. Karen wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to provoke, to pull him into her storm. But Sam wasn't going anywhere, and storms, no matter how loud, always passed. The ceramic gnome disappeared the following morning, and Sam never saw who removed it. Whether it was Karen reclaiming her message or someone else cleaning up what didn't belong, didn't matter. What mattered was the shift that followed. The lake seemed to hold its breath for a few days, a false quiet settling over the shoreline like morning fog. Karen stopped appearing at the edge of her yard. Her lawn remained untrimmed. The rhythmic squeal of her hose, which usually came alive at dawn, stayed silent. Her absence was not peace. It was retreat, and anyone who had ever dealt with a person like her knew that retreat never meant surrender. It meant preparation. And Sam, who had spent his life navigating machines, contracts, and quietly manipulative people in equal measure, knew better than to mistake silence for victory. The return came not in the form of yelling or vandalism or another letter, but through bureaucracy, one of the oldest and most effective weapons in a neighbor's arsenal. It began with a visit from a county inspector, this time sent not to check the dock's structure, but to investigate an anonymous complaint about unlicensed mechanical work being conducted on the premises. The inspector, a tired-looking man with an apologetic manner, knocked on Sam's cabin just after 9 a.m., clipboard already open. "It's probably nothing," he said, "but we got a report that you're running an unauthorized business from the property. Something about engine work, potential environmental hazards." Sam stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word, and gestured toward the bench, the sealed containers, the labeled solvents, the stored waste containers with certified labels, all properly handled, all logged, all clean. The inspector stayed for nearly an hour, carefully walking the perimeter, taking photos, checking dates, nodding quietly to himself. When he left, he thanked Sam for his cooperation and promised to file the visit as compliant. "But just so you know," he added, "when we get a call like this, they usually don't stop at 1. Sam nodded. He hadn't expected they would. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated. A fire safety officer appeared to inspect the storage of flammable materials. Again, in response to an anonymous complaint. A zoning compliance rep visited after receiving a report that Sam had built a non-permitted structure, clearly referring to a temporary tool shed that had been on the property since before he moved in. Each visit ended the same. Polite apologies, nothing to report, case closed. But it wasn't the individual inspections that wore on Sam. It was the accumulation, the steady pressure, the interruption of work, the ever-present sense of someone trying to exhaust him into leaving. But Sam didn't leave. He fortified instead. Each time a complaint was filed, he documented the inspection, requested official statements of compliance, and added them to his now impressive file of records. He installed a locked tool chest inside the cabin and moved the most expensive equipment indoors. He added motion lights along the trail and a second layer of security to the camera system, this time uploading directly to a private cloud. Not because he was afraid, because he was calculating. The more he did to prepare, the more she had to work to reach him, and eventually she'd misstep. The breaking point came unexpectedly, not from Karen directly, but from a third party. Sam returned from town one afternoon to find a vehicle parked near his driveway, a black pickup with tinted windows and an unfamiliar plate. 2 men stood by the dock, both in jeans and jackets, one holding a folder, the other pointing toward the water. As Sam approached, the man with the folder stepped forward and introduced himself as a representative of a local real estate management firm. His tone was professional, neutral, but not friendly. "We were informed there's a dispute over access rights to the lakefront," he said, and that the current occupant may be interfering with long-established easements. Sam's eyebrows rose. He asked who filed the claim. The man didn't answer, only said the matter was under review and that their firm was exploring all relevant interests on behalf of concerned parties. When Sam asked them to leave the property, they hesitated, just long enough to establish dominance before complying. That night, Sam called the property owner again, detailed the encounter, and received clear confirmation. There were no easements, no shared rights, no unresolved claims. "She's fishing," the owner said, "trying to get someone to bite. Don't let her pull you into it." Sam didn't respond. He was past frustration, past indignation. What he felt now was resolve. Karen had escalated into legal manipulation, reaching out to third parties, inventing threats where none existed. That meant she was no longer trying to win. She was trying to sabotage. If she couldn't take control of the dock, she would make it so unpleasant, so riddled with conflict and red tape that no one would want it. The retaliation came quickly after the failed real estate stunt. Late one night, long after most lights on the lake had gone out, Sam's security feed captured something new. A figure, unmistakably Karen, led a small group of teenagers down the slope. They were carrying coolers and blankets. They made no effort to hide. The camera's timestamp caught everything. The group slipping the chain from the dock gate, stepping over the signs, spreading out across the platform with music, drinks, and laughter. For a moment, Sam just watched. Not because he was surprised, but because he was impressed. This was Karen's final tactic: make the dock unusable by force of presence, drown it in petty invasions, turn it into a hangout, a public nuisance. And then she could march into any meeting and say, "See? I told you, he's out of control." Sam didn't go outside. He didn't yell. He didn't call the police. He waited until they had left, around 3:30 a.m., according to the feed, and then he made 2 phone calls, one to the landlord and one to the local precinct. He didn't demand arrests. He didn't file charges. He simply requested that the prior trespassing report be amended to include the new footage and that a formal no-access order be issued and logged. The landlord, furious at this point, began drafting a cease-and-desist letter to Karen and threatened to pursue damages for harassment if any further disruptions occurred. But it wasn't until the final incident that everything snapped into place. 3 days later, in the middle of a warm Saturday afternoon, Sam was in the cabin when he heard shouting, panicked, high-pitched, and sudden. He rushed outside and found Karen soaked, humiliated, and trapped in the shallows by the dock. Her sundress clung to her frame, her hair matted, and one of her shoes floated nearby. She was screaming, not for help, but in outrage. "It's your fault," she shrieked. "You made this unsafe. You set a trap." A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, a few teenagers, 2 men from further down the lake. No one moved to help her. No one believed her. Sam stood at the top of the dock stairs, arms folded, expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone had seen the signs. Everyone knew about the warnings, the complaints, the inspections. And now, everyone had seen her fall. Literally, physically, and metaphorically. Eventually, she climbed out on her own, slipped, cursed, staggered across the lawn, and disappeared into her house. No apologies, no acknowledgments, only silence. But it was the kind of silence that stayed. That week, Sam received a message from the county. Karen had withdrawn all formal complaints. The property owner emailed him a copy of her written acknowledgement of the dock's private status. And several neighbors, unprompted, began waving again. Because escalation only works when people play along. And Sam had made it clear, through patience, discipline, and absolute composure, that he wasn't here to play. The waterline receded slightly in the days after Karen's fall, and with it went the last remnants of her public dominance. Her dock, once a casual observation post where she staged her passive surveillance, stood empty. Her lawn, previously trimmed with ritualistic precision, began to yellow in uneven patches, neglected and forgotten. She didn't reappear at the edge of the property, didn't shout greetings or passive-aggressive commentary across the yards. The windows of her home remained closed. If it weren't for the subtle flicker of television light through the curtains at night, Sam might have believed the house had gone entirely still. But silence didn't mean resolution. And Sam, who had seen how people resisted change even when cornered by their own actions, knew better than to assume she was finished. People like Karen didn't bow out after embarrassment. They recalculated. They looked for cracks in the story, leveraged sympathy from unfamiliar faces, and built new versions of events in which they were the victims. So, when a certified letter arrived at the cabin 3 days later, Sam already knew what it would contain before he opened it. The letter came from an attorney representing Karen. It was 5 pages long, wrapped in legalese so thick it could have choked a judge, but the message was clear. She was filing a formal complaint alleging negligence on Sam's part that resulted in her fall. The dock, she claimed, had been left in a deliberately hazardous state, an uneven plank or a slick surface, though she didn't specify which, causing her to slip and sustain physical injury and emotional distress. The complaint threatened civil action. If a settlement wasn't reached, or if he didn't agree to remove what she now called a community hazard. Sam read the letter twice. He made no notes, made no calls immediately. Instead, he walked outside and stood at the top of the dock stairs, watching the afternoon light shimmer across the lake. The wood beneath his feet was level, clean, dry. The surface had been sealed with anti-slip treatment, the supports braced and reinforced, all maintenance logged in detail. Every bolt had been tightened and double-checked. The incident, the fall, had occurred during a clear, dry afternoon, not in rain or under duress, and the entire approach had been marked with signs, warnings, and security tape, all clearly visible and documented in photographs. She hadn't slipped because of faulty construction. She had slipped because she had trespassed, again, and stepped onto something that never belonged to her. So Sam responded the only way he knew how, methodically, calmly, with precision. He forwarded the letter to his landlord and to a legal contact who had helped him once before with contract disputes. The response came within a day, a formal rejection of the complaint, citing Karen's documented trespassing history, the existence of multiple prior police reports, timestamps from the security cameras, and the results of the county's prior inspection, certifying the dock as compliant. The lawyer added a warning. If Karen or her representation pursued the matter further, they would be met not only with a counterclaim but with a lawsuit for defamation and harassment. That same afternoon, Sam submitted a final, comprehensive packet to the police. It contained every report, every inspection, every photo, every correspondence, and 3 time-stamped security videos. The file was not submitted as an accusation, but as a full legal archive, a final safeguard to make sure there was no ambiguity left. It wasn't about drama anymore. It was about closure, about proving, beyond any possible spin or reinterpretation, that he had acted within his rights from the beginning. A week passed, then 2. No response came from Karen's attorney. No further letters. No new complaints. And still, her house remained silent. Until one morning, just before sunrise, when a white SUV appeared in her driveway. A younger woman stepped out, mid-30s, professionally dressed, clipboard in hand. Over the next 2 hours, she walked the perimeter of Karen's yard, took notes, made several phone calls, and eventually left without knocking. That afternoon, a small sign appeared near Karen's mailbox. Property for sale. Viewings by appointment only. Sam didn't celebrate. He didn't make assumptions. He just waited. Because people like Karen often had one last move in them, one final card to play when they sensed their hold slipping completely. That move came, ironically, in the form of apology, Not directly, but through a proxy. The following evening, Vince, the neighbor who had once warned Sam about Karen's pattern, appeared at the edge of his drive. He didn't approach fully, just called out once and waited for permission to speak. When Sam gave a nod, Vince stepped forward, hands in his pockets. "She asked me to pass on a message," he said. "Didn't want to face you. Said she regrets how things turned out. Said it got out of hand." Sam didn't answer at first. He studied Vince's expression, looking for the catch, the performance. But Vince's tone was steady, not defensive. "She's leaving," he added. "Says it's time. She's not well." Not just physically. She knows she pushed too far. Maybe she didn't expect someone to push back. Sam finally spoke. "I didn't push back," he said quietly. "I just didn't move." Vince nodded like he understood. Then he turned and left. That night, the lake was still again. Still, but not tense. The lights in Karen's house flickered once and then went dark. The only sound came from the soft tap of insects against the windows and the distant hoot of an owl calling through the trees. No legal threats, no shouts across the property line. Just a silence that no longer hid danger, but relief. And Sam stood at the edge of the dock, hands in his pockets, not triumphant, but steady. Because the climax wasn't in the moment Karen fell. It was in her realization that she had nothing left to stand on. Karen's house sold faster than Sam expected. Within 3 weeks of the sign going up, the property had an offer. A modest one, he assumed, because the lawn hadn't been kept, the siding had started to peel near the chimney, and the interior hadn't seen a renovation since the early 2000s at best. But someone bought it anyway. A couple from out of state, judging by the license plate on the SUV that pulled into the drive one bright Thursday morning. Sam didn't watch them with suspicion. He didn't feel the need. He had already made peace with what had passed. The worst part about conflict was that it consumed your attention like fire did oxygen. So slowly, you didn't notice how much it had taken until it was gone. And now that it was over, all Sam felt was space. Not empty, not even quiet. Just space. Space to work. Space to think. Space to finally listen to the natural rhythm of the lake without that underlying tension vibrating through the dirt. Karen left without ceremony. One early morning, Sam heard the wheels of her suitcase bumping down the wooden steps, and when he stepped out onto his porch, she was already in the passenger seat of an Uber, staring straight ahead. She didn't look over. She didn't wave. Sam didn't expect her to. Maybe she felt shame. Maybe just exhaustion. It didn't matter. She was gone, and with her went the heavy, invisible net that had hung over his stretch of shoreline since the day he moved in. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Small, almost imperceptible things began to happen. A man from 3 cabins down, someone who had previously never made eye contact, stopped by while Sam was changing the plug on a generator and offered him a cup of coffee. A retired teacher who lived across the inlet waved from her deck and shouted over, "I'm glad you stayed." The tension, once clinging to every fence post and hedgerow, began to lift, as if a long winter had finally ended. No one said Karen's name. They didn't need to. The absence said enough. The dock, battered by months of quiet war, now stood as more than a place to test engines or cast a line. It had become, almost incidentally, a symbol, not just of ownership, but of persistence, of the boundaries people are allowed to hold and the consequences when others refuse to respect them. Sam didn't decorate it. He didn't host barbecues or events. He simply used it, as he always had, with care and intention, every bolt and beam now a physical affirmation that he had done the right thing, even when it had cost him comfort, peace, and more patience than he thought he had. When the new neighbors moved in, Sam introduced himself. Their names were Doug and Ellie, early 50s, polite, no visible desire to dominate or restore anything. They seemed interested in quiet, maybe even in healing, like they were leaving behind noise of their own. During that first handshake, Doug glanced at the doc and said, "Heard there was a situation before we got here." Sam nodded once. "There was." Doug hesitated, then asked, "Should we be worried?" Sam looked out at the water, then back. "No," he said, "not anymore." Work on the engine wrapped 2 weeks later. The boat ran smooth, clean, like it was fresh off the line. Sam packed up his tools, labeled every piece of scrap, and shipped the completed project to the collector who had first brought him here. He didn't sign on for another job right away. He wasn't sure if he wanted to. For the first time in a long time, he felt no urgency to prove his worth through motion. The lake had taught him something more valuable, how to stand his ground, and, more importantly, when not to move. One late evening, as the sun threw its last color across the surface, Sam sat at the end of the dock with his boots resting on the final beam. Ellie wandered down the path from her yard, a glass of iced tea in hand. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Sam gestured to the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the frogs and the rustle of reeds. After a few minutes, she said, "You ever think about how people just decide something is theirs?" Sam didn't answer right away. He knew she wasn't talking about the dock, not really. "Yeah," he finally said, "but eventually the land, the water, they remind you, remind everyone." She nodded and took a sip of her drink. "I like that." So did Sam, because this place wasn't just where he'd fought for peace. It was where he'd learned to protect it. And that kind of victory, quiet, hard-won, and uncelebrated, was the only one worth keeping.